Hello everyone, and welcome to this cozy space that I have created. I'm back, and it's been a minute since I have been here, but I've been comfortably resting in Melbourne's winter cold. The other day, I picked up a pair of Paraboots online, and when they arrived at my doorstep and I opened up the box, I was really inspired. And today I thought I would share that with you, because it's been a while. But before that, I don't know if you've noticed, but the house looks a little different. This cozy space has gone through some changes. The TV, well, that's a new addition. Getting used to the new changes in the house, but a little bit of change, a little bit of different design choice is always good. Now onto the Paraboot Michael. Now I was fortunate enough to pick up this pair from Inku with their end of financial year sale that's on right now. Designed in 1945, these legendary French shoes were originally made for architects and vets, and of those things I am neither. I picked them up in the Lis Vert color, a beautiful dark green. And each pair comes with this little book on the Paraboot. Maybe I'll open it up and give it a read for you. For over 100 years, our specialist workers have been cutting, sewing, and fashioning leather, using know-how passed down from generation to generation. Each pair of Paraboot is unique. We use top quality, full grain leather, most of which is tanned in France. The manufacturing techniques we use, such as Norwegian reverse welted, Goodyear machine welted, and Blake sewn, are still traditional in nature. The genuine rubber soles are also molded in our own workshop in the French Alps. No fewer than 150 operations are required to produce our shoes, making Paraboot shoes an outstanding product. One that's made in France too. Care should be taken to use all our products as intended. Paraboot shoes are renowned for being hard wearing, but we cannot guarantee our shoes against normal wear and tear, accidents, or inappropriate use or storage. To extend the life of your Paraboot shoes, make sure not to wear them 2 days running. Now for those who don't know, one of my favourite shoes for years, if not decades, was the Clark's Wallabies. But very recently, I did notice that the quality had dropped. Well, maybe not so recently, but maybe the last few years. I really like that kind of cut of shoe, and I've been looking for an alternative, and the Paraboot Michael actually seems to be my perfect alternative. Now the leather is so beautiful. They feel incredible in person, but Paraboot is modern style. They're a heritage brand, and they actually are credited for being one of the pioneers of the rubber sole shoe. They're still made in France, in-house, and have not sold out. Now something did happen to me the other day. I actually fell off my bike, and I don't know if you can see this here. Oh, and I have a hole now. It's from spring-summer 2020. And Iskander is not a brand that I can really get pieces of again. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop the Paraboots on, and I'm just going to go for a bit of a thrift, bring my laptop, go to a cafe, do a bit of editing, and just go back to a cozy day in the life. And I'll do a little bit of thrifting. I've been looking for CDs lately because I now have a portable CD player. Yeah. And hopefully over time in winter, there'll be more videos to see. But for now, let's get out there and wear these shoes. Now I've heard a lot about breaking these in, so I intentionally wore my Capital socks alongside my spring-summer 2026 Oslo fatigues. And I like how all these colours come together, the various greens and olives, and of course my Capital scarf to top it off, the wabi-sabi life. So as I step out there into the world for the very first time, well, I think the combination is perfect. And the first steps hit the ground, and I must say they feel very, very comfortable right out of the box. While walking, I do make sure to take everything in, stop and absorb the world in these new beautiful shoes that I'm wearing. And in this neighbourhood, anything that sparks joy, I will stop to look at. Wow, I admire things like this. I admire the world around me. So let me take you for a walk in my shoes. Walk with me through the cozy inner city north as I give these Paraboots some character for the very first time. Paraboots on cobblestone. Well, some people have said this shoe is very hard to break in, and I must say, I think it's because I have a really wide fit that I was able to just put them on and have them feel this way, because I've heard stories of people struggling with sizing, for example. I wear a size 43 euro or a US 10 or a UK 9. If you've tried to buy a pair of Paraboots before, you know sizing can be sometimes limited in them, and I think, yeah, just because of the nature of how they do sell out, and having sizing issues with shoes in the past, I did have a little bit of worry and anxiety, but in the end, I think I made the right choice, and these are a perfect fit for me. Oh, that's so beautiful. These shoes will bring forth many Brunswick journeys, and on my walks, I will stop to smell the flowers. I enjoy walks, it's cold, but there's a warmth in the everyday moments, the small moments, the moments that we might forget, to stop and just appreciate the world around. A reminder that despite the season in Melbourne, there's always going to be a pop of colour, and I think that's one of the things I really enjoy about just the overall vibe. It's like when I opened the box and saw the leather for the first time, I was really taken back by how beautiful it looked. I'm not sure if that's how everybody sees the world. It's simplicity of reflections, or how a tram passes, or how a pair of these Paraboots feel on my feet, walking as the leather breaks in slowly. And now you know what it feels like to walk in my shoes, even just for a short time. And I've been trying to find more physical media lately at op shops, but lately the search for CDs has been fun but harder to find. I think everyone's holding on to their physical media, but today I did find 2 classics, and for that I am totally grateful for this. I head next door to the Epilepsy Foundation op shop to see Camille. I love Camille. I love you, Camille. Love you, Camille. You're my best friend. Dancing, Camille. Ooh, bouncy. Gorgeous girl. Hey. Aren't you the best? Aren't you the cutest? Aren't you the cutest? Look at you, look at you. I play catch with my favorite poodle and I check the CDs. Bye, bye-bye. 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 And then I step out and head to Bench Coffee, walking past these Melbourne winter colours. A batch brew is on my mind, a batch brew is what I need. And walking in, I see the most beautiful green wall, and I'm reminded of my inspiration to wear olive lately. Like my new Paraboots, like my recent jacket, it's all speaking to me, the age patina of this beautiful green wall. And it's important to walk towards the things that you like, to appreciate the path that you walk, and the slight differences and variations in the coffee and the flavour and the things that you consume. Now, it's been a while since I've posted. In this season I've been working hard, saving, and it's been a cold winter, but a rewarding one. And with each step I take, I must say the path always leads me back to perfectly cozy. Now, know this. Today this episode's about the Paraboots, but I want to say if you've ever said hi to me out there, please know you have encouraged me to get back up and film this episode. It's been too long, but I now am writing the ideas on the wall, and I will follow through and walk the path. I'll take it slow, one step at a time, but know you encouraged me out there. And thank you so much. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon. Stay cozy.